It's good to remember that God will meet us in our sadness. Jesus was acquainted with sadness, and so he has that experience.
Greetings and welcome, everyone, to Breaking Bread, the podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. It's good, as always, to have you along. Kathy Knuckle and Brian Suter are with me here today. Welcome to both of you.
Hey, thanks.
The concept and topic of emotion come up a fair amount around this venue through this podcast. Yes. I've certainly been blessed by that, just to see the depth of the human experience. And while emotions are, well, they're ethereal in some ways, right? They're kind of beyond words. And truly, they really are beyond words. It is an experience, and yet it also communicates. It's communicating in a couple different directions, too. It communicates outward and it communicates inward.
Oh, sure. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I always love it when some perspective and help is given on that particular topic. I want to needle in on one negative emotion, and that is sadness. Kind of my own voice comes to me in this moment. And I remember just in the recent days looking at Rebecca and saying, I am so sad, you know, and we all have that. That's not unique to me, right? I am so sad. What do we do with sadness? What is it communicating outward and inward? And how do we healthily walk through sadness? Is that a fair way to tee it up?
Yeah, no, I think those are really great questions. And emotions, like, you know, that's certainly a space that we do delve into a lot around this place, and thinking about how we understand emotions, what we believe about emotions, how we interact with emotions is just such a big deal. And I think one of the things that comes to mind right away is from a counseling mindset. When you say that sadness is a negative emotion, I think probably both of our alarm bells go off, Kathy and I, and say, we wouldn't call it a negative emotion. We would call it an uncomfortable emotion.
Yes. Painful.
Yeah, fill that space out. Yeah. That's good.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good just for people to recognize that all emotions are a gift. And so whether you're feeling happy or sad, like you've stated, it's communicating something, but it's not good or bad. Like even anger would have a proper place. And so being able to recognize that there is positive things that come from sadness, or it can be a okay, good emotion to experience.
Yeah.
Right. In many ways, they're kind of like as we're driving along, whether it's the gravel road, there may not be a lot of signs on the gravel road, or the highway, as we pass signs, they're giving us information.
Kathy, he's from Missouri.
I tell you, I grew up on a lot more gravel roads.
Interstate.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I'm getting very sad here as we're talking. But I think in some ways, I think it's helpful to think of emotions kind of like those signs that we pass that are giving us information. And if we can learn what that information is and how to interact with it in a helpful way, it changes the game a bit, I think.
And as I think about, I love uncomfortable emotion. It absolutely is. It is tough to be in the same room with somebody who's sad. And I definitely feel like my job in that moment is to make them unsad.
Right.
Right? Do you think that's universal? I mean, is that what we do?
Yeah, and I would even say in my role as a counselor, when someone is very sad in session, it can bring up just a little bit of, I'm not uncomfortable with sadness, but a little bit of discomfort of like, where do we go with this? I can't solve the sadness. Somebody has to walk through it. And actually, I would tell people that experiencing the sadness is a good thing. Like, you need to feel the sadness.
And I think in that, like, to acknowledge that the sadness can make us very uncomfortable, and almost always that does push us into, what do I do to get rid of? And if we can even notice that pull, and I think then kind of shift into what you're talking about there, Kathy, is, okay, wait, maybe that's not my job. Maybe the sadness is important for us to connect to. Maybe it has something that it's trying to communicate, and getting rid of it actually isn't going to be productive in the long run.
Yeah. And not only do we do that interpersonally, but we also do that within ourselves, too. Oh, I'm feeling sad.
Right.
So what kind of interference do I need to run in this moment within myself to get out from underneath the emotion?
In our modern day, one of the things that we've gotten really good at is learning different ways to help solve problems and to kind of move pretty quickly towards being able to feel better or different. But in some ways, that's kind of developed a lot of unhealthy ways of getting rid of sadness that actually then create more problems on the other side of it.
Can you give us maybe an example of that?
Well, one thing I would say to that is sadness is a unique emotion in that it can be something that somebody is walking through a season of sadness. It's not just like, again, like to use anger, we kind of can feel momentary like irritation or anger, but sadness is something that somebody can experience over the long run, kind of the grief piece,
Hmm.
but then also be connecting with joy and positive experiences in the moment. It's like two things can be true at the same time with sadness
Okay.
sometimes.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And then I think the trouble with that is if we work, like Brian was saying, just to numb our sadness, then we're numbing the joy or the other emotions that can be going on with life too.
Okay, so that sadness cooperates in a healthy manner with those other emotions.
Hmm. And I think it's interesting, even, as we read the scripture, we're promised someday that there won't be any sorrow and those tears will be wiped away. And while we don't know exactly what that means, I think one of the realities it points to is as we live in a fallen world where there is death, where there is loss, the natural product of that is sadness. So in some ways, to be able to view sadness as, well, that means that there was a good or a desirable thing that's no longer there. Sometimes, certainly, we can have sadness about losing something that wasn't good as well. But in some ways, sadness is connecting us to this reality that I had something positive, and when there's a void, then it's sad.
Yeah.
Could even say then from an apologetic argument, sadness is an indicator within us that there is a good and a right thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that speaks even into the teachings of Jesus, where he talks about, blessed are those that mourn. Why? Because they will be comforted. I think you're exactly right. It's kind of that inner yearning for things to be restored. And we as believers, that makes sense to us and connects with the storyline of the scriptures.
Mm-hmm. You had said a moment ago about the numbing that can happen. And I think we kind of follow that, but I think an example would be helpful, Brian. Can you give that?
Yeah. So, and I think it can show up in so many different ways, but generally at a high level would just be where we're feeling something that we don't like and we look to something to kind of neutralize that pain. So, whether that's like looking on our phones, whether getting on YouTube or the social media app, or food would be another thing, or drugs and alcohol or sex, those sorts of things that kind of bring just a checking out, or they bring like a dopamine response in our brain that neutralizes the sadness. Those are easy things to move into.
Well, I know I've said sometimes that it's either I'm going to laugh or cry. So
Yeah,
let's laugh instead. And certainly laugh has its beautiful place. And I think even in the healing process and all of that. But to your point, I think.
Yeah.
Well, and in helping people to slow down and feel their sadness is really important, which is kind of what you were talking about, even if we can help that with kids or other people in our lives, which sometimes I can encourage that through like the use of journaling or something like that to just account for and notice what is making you sad, because then you can grieve it. And then I think when we were talking about like the using too much humor or that sort of thing, or the avoidance, it happens because we haven't just allowed our bodies to slow down and experience the grief.
So now you're really getting to that tactic of how you would help a person, Kathy. And part of that is a slowing down process whereby you do the sadness well. Sounds to me, journaling and otherwise.
Yes.
Yeah. Which I think in many ways is just being able to identify the emotion, which sometimes it sounds pretty simple, but it's actually quite hard. Like, am I feeling sad, or what is it that's going on here? And maybe how is this a little bit different than what I was feeling, last week? And then, like you said, sometimes it just doesn't even register why we might be feeling that, or what are the things that have happened this week that maybe have piled up and kind of contribute to. If we don't slow down and even just consider those things, it doesn't register, and then a lot of times it just festers.
Yeah. And because we inaccurately say, well, I'm not crying, or I don't have tears coming out of my eyes, so I can't be sad. But you can be feeling those effects of being sad without that physical symptom of tears or...
So, Kathy, would you say that sometimes working with a person in the counseling room, you have helped them see that they're sad and they didn't know they were? Is that true?
Well, and I think what I can kind of hear without them saying it is, like, if there has been something that has came to an end, or they're in a transition or that sort of thing, being able to point out, this feels a little bit to me like grief over the ending of something or the whatever the
Unrealized
situation.
expectation.
Yes, definitely. And I think what I notice is for somebody to think about, like, could this be grief? It can be really helpful, and it gives a different perspective. Like, it's It's different than frustrated, or it's different than anxious, or it's different than, any other emotion.
Because they've come in saying, I'm frustrated, I'm
Right.
anxious,
Yeah.
and those types of things. So that's what's on their radar.
Yeah.
And you're helping them see that there's something else
Yes.
at play here and needs to be paid
Yeah.
attention to.
Yeah.
Which I think speaks to the reality that a lot of times we experience mixed emotions. And so that means that we experience lots of different emotions at the same time. And some of those emotions we're going to be more comfortable with, and some that we're going to be less comfortable with. So then we're going to tend to highlight or identify the ones we're more comfortable with, and slowing down and saying, oh, wait, actually, maybe sadness is part of this, or underneath of this can be helpful again. Whereas sometimes we would be like, I don't know what this is, but I know what anger is. I'll stick with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know things are not linear, things are not formulaic, but provide some help in the sense of laying out the landscape. It simply says, this might be what sadness is telling you, and this is how we think about it, and this is how we move through it and are healthily sad. Kathy, you've already tipped your hat to it, I think, in recognizing it. Can we go another step?
Yeah. Grief is like the process through which you're sorting through sadness, and depending on how big of a loss something is that we've experienced, that grief might be a very thought through process you have to do really purposefully, or something that you naturally move forward and you haven't even realized that you've gone through those steps.
Well, let's say a little bit more about steps in grief.
Yeah. So I think in grief, we're thinking about, okay, there's a loss. And then generally on the other side of that becomes like the protest, like, man, I don't want to lose that. I wish I could have that back. And that makes sense. And then as we give way to the next step, then that's going to move us into despair. And the despair is basically the emotional response. So depending on how big the loss is, despair is going to fit. If it's a really significant loss, it might be something less intense than despair, if it's a smaller loss. And then as we keep moving forward, the next step really is acceptance, and being able to accept, oh, yeah, this thing is gone, and I don't have to like that it's gone. I don't want it to be gone, but that's the reality. And then thinking about, okay, what does life look like in this reality? And then you go around that circle a lot of times.
You can slip in and out of those stages, having been there already, and now I'm back there again.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would you say that there would be some that don't push to that level simply because they know what they should be feeling? They know that you should be accepting, whether it's this is God's timing, right?
Sure.
This is God's timing. This is God's will, and so all of a sudden that's kind of forcing my hand to prematurely accept. Is that a truth?
Sure.
Can we prematurely accept, I guess is my question.
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think that the challenge is are you working through the steps, and is it a genuine acceptance? And I think just based on how God's put different people together, or the different losses they've maybe processed already in their life, some are going to be much better at that step and able to step into it very early. But sometimes I think we're so quick to say, I don't want to feel the sadness, or I shouldn't be sad about this, or I'm through it, that it sometimes, you find out after a little discovery that it's a false acceptance.
Okay. Yeah.
Which, and some of that makes me think too, people love to avoid the sadness. And it maybe goes back to Matt's original comment of like, because it feels like a negative emotion or a like a weakness, when it's not that. It's actually, it's healing for your body to feel the sadness and grieve or process through it.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting too, all of these things that we were talking about a lot of times are on a spectrum. And so one side of the spectrum is we want to kind of avoid it. On the other side of the spectrum sometimes is you get lost in it,
right,
and you can't get any distance. And that's where sometimes being able to, like we talked about earlier, use humor to be able to step out of the sadness, if it's like a stepping out of rather than avoiding, can be really beneficial. So then you can kind of go back in, you catch your breath.
Catch your breath. That's exactly what I was thinking. Get a breather, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, when it's too close, you lose perspective on the other things that are grounding for you, like the other things that are bringing you joy or peace or that sort of thing.
Right. And sometimes when it's been so close for so long, then you start to see that as part of who you are, or this is how people relate to me. And if I lose this, is that going to change, all these relationships or who I am? Or even sometimes when there's been a significant loss, like to think about moving to a place where you're more settled, like a significant loss, there's maybe going to always be a degree of sadness around that. But the thought of getting to a healthier place with is like, wow, does that mean that it didn't matter, or that I didn't really care? No, not at all. But those are the sort of internal thoughts sometimes that are really hard to sort through.
Yeah. And so what I heard you say is too close. So
Mhm.
there is
Yep.
this proper relationship we have with the matter and that we have with sadness. And you can be too close to it where it becomes an identifier. Sounded to me
Right.
like you were
Yeah.
speaking in identity terms.
Right.
It then becomes our identity, and that would be not healthy.
Yeah.
Right.
Would you say that if it's too far away, that's where we would have identified that there's a lot of avoidance happening there, or
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, too, like we've talked about in the grief process, the emotion of sadness is going to be far at times and closer at times, appropriately so. And so you just got to be able to think about, okay, where am I at? And putting ourselves in a community that can walk us through that and say, oh, no, you should be really close to the sadness right now. Of course that makes sense. Or, what would it look like to give yourself a little bit of a breather? That might be wise or helpful, and then we can step back into it. And that's where I think being around people and so that they can speak into it and walk with you is such an important thing of the sadness as well.
it's good to remember that God will meet us in our sadness. Jesus was acquainted with sadness, and so he has that experience.
Yeah. And I think what a beautiful picture just to be able to think that in our sadness, sometimes what sadness does is it wants to shut us down and kind of isolate us and like, oh, go away. But
Right.
to just have this picture of Christ being with us, that
Right.
he's not afraid of our sadness, that he's not disgusted by our sadness, but he's with us and weeps with us, I
Yeah.
think is so powerful.
Yeah.
You've really made a strong case for the incredible potential of sadness.
Mhm.
If indeed moving through sadness includes an invitation to God to be in it, or maybe a realization that He
Oh, yeah.
is in it,
Sure.
really brings Him near. And so now I'm going to risk some vulnerability here.
Mm-hmm.
But I have noticed if I've made Rebecca sad,
Mm-hmm.
that's really uncomfortable, right?
Sure.
And I want the sadness to stop,
Yeah.
right? And so as a husband, I try to run interference. But to recognize that, no, she needs that. That's what I'm learning here. She needs that sadness.
Yeah.
And there's actually a healthy dependence she's going to find with Jesus
Mm-hmm.
apart from me fixing it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Which is another uncomfortable husband
Right.
position to be in.
Right.
And I think husbands kind of go on record for, wanting to try, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh,
Really regretting that.
absolutely.
So
Yeah.
my point in the matter is allowing sadness to have that perfect work
Uh-huh.
of finding God enough
Yeah.
for the loss that we're experiencing.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. That he has something to offer and that he joins us in it. And if we can make space for that and sit with the uncomfortable long enough, that there's something, really beautiful that can come, that the ashes can be made
Mhm.
new and beautiful.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And so to recap, we recognize the sadness, we name it. We don't necessarily push it away. We invite Christ into it, see him very near to it. And then what?
I would say from there, it's important to just kind of have the mindset of or be curious about how do I move forward with this sadness as I integrate into life or as I keep moving with life.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be more accurate to say moving forward, not with the sadness, but with the loss? I mean, does the sadness go with us forever, or is it the loss that goes with us forever?
Mm.
I think probably a degree of both. But yeah, to be able to, if we keep looking in the rearview mirror about, what has been lost, then, that's going to be the thing where we kind of keep looking back and thinking about what's been lost. But if we move forward in this, okay, yeah, this loss is real and a reality, but now what are the opportunities in front of me, or how can I engage life now in the midst of whatever is here is really an important step.
The phrase of time will heal it isn't, time itself doesn't heal, but if you allow yourself to keep moving with the sadness, there's the new experiences that come in that start to diminish or decrease, or there's less sadness, more joy, or there's possibility for other emotions there.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really, really helpful. So I asked for that clarification Because I was thinking that we would move forward with the loss, but not the sadness. It would like run its course. But even as both of you hesitated with that correction, I kind of get a sense now that moving on sometimes does kind of throw those emotions out, but moving forward now, it includes and retains the emotions
Mm-hmm.
in my person and in my
Right.
past,
Right.
and that is part of my story,
Right.
but it has a different pull and
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
effect.
Yeah.
Moving on would be like ignoring maybe some of the lessons or some of the experience that you walked through there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's, one of the visuals that comes to me is after a loss, there's going to be big waves, high intensity of sadness, and they're going to be really close together, those waves. But as they kind of move out, kind of in a concentric circle, those waves get a little bit not quite as intense and they're not quite as frequent. And that's going to be hopefully part of the journey. So, if you've walked through, let's say, the loss of a child, and all of a sudden you're there celebrating your friends who have eighth graders who are graduating, you're like, man, I don't even know why, but I'm sad. And then upon reflection, you're like, oh, wait, yeah, it would have been a graduation for me too.
And that's a great example. The loss certainly is always with us,
Yep.
and the sadness will always be too.
Yeah.
Sure, right.
Yeah. Yeah, which is, again, just the interesting piece with the emotion of sadness. Like we can walk through a time of something that really exciting or happy that has happened, and we can look back on the memory and remember the happiness. But I think the thing with sadness is just what Brian said, is it hits in like waves. And then all of a sudden it's gone for a while, but then it comes back like a wave. Over time, that the waves decrease.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I think to your point earlier too, Kathy, it's not just time itself.
Right.
It's the time and walking through the process of making space for and those steps that we've just talked through. And I think it's really important to make sure those get paired together.
Yeah.
That's good. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Kathy. I think a common human experience as we reflect on all of our lives is those losses that bring sadness or make us into who we are.
Mm.
And God has as we read in the scriptures, beauty from ashes. He works redemption in this particular area, which this particular emotion signals, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And I think the way both of you shared that and how sadness ultimately brings us back to him is a testimony to that and makes sense. So I appreciate that. That was really helpful. Thanks.
Matt.
Each one for listening in. Thanks for being on.